Well, good morning everybody, and thank you for such a warm welcome to Oslo. Mr. Governing Mayor Stian in particular. It's a pleasure to be here. You've already realised I can't speak Norwegian. I don't speak English very well either because I'm Australian. But I hope you can understand me. What I want to do is spend the next 20 minutes or so just telling you a little about smarter cities, at least as IBM sees it globally, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes for some questions that some of you may have. Cities haven't changed much in thousands of years. I was in the Middle East a couple of weeks ago talking about Greece, Rome and Athens, and I was corrected and told that it really was Damascus and Jericho that was 7,000 and 8,000 years ago that really started to bring cities together. And really, if you think about those cities, they grappled with the same issues we have today. They had problems with transport, they had people in housing, they had transport issues, they had places where the children came together to learn, they had sick people in hospitals, they had some people that had to be separated from others. That hasn't really changed a great deal until about the last 20 years. And what's happened the last 20 years is we have introduced an electronic fabric to cities in the world that has fundamentally changed the way in which people live and work. The thing that brought Damascus and Rome and Athens and Oslo together over the years was essentially commerce and trade. And I'm delighted to be here this morning through Stian's organisation to know that we have both public and private sector here in the room, because really it's trade that underpins so much that happens in our cities. So what we've seen in the last 20 years is the introduction of an electronic capability that has given us the chance to do things that we never thought possible before. And really, those things happen in three big chunks. And the first chunk is what, perhaps we can call the instrumented world. Many refer to as Internet of Things, the idea that dumb things have become intelligent. And so whether we're talking about cars or buildings or livestock in fields. I mean, who would have thought? My grandparents died 35 years ago. Who would have thought that he could understand that cattle now communicate with the farmer directly about how they're feeling on a particular day? So these things have really brought about a ability to sense things. And the best senses we have, of course, are what everybody in the room has in their hands, I hope, or in their pockets probably, is a mobile phone, which makes us very powerful sensors. All of these things together, instrumented, generate a vast amount of data, huge amounts of data. So I saw a statistic last week that said it's now 32 hours. Every 32 hours, we are now generating the same amount of data generated in all of human history until 2005. Every 32 hours. So we think about some of these online musical services globally that give us access all around the world to music. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of data. All music ever made on record is tiny compared to some of the numbers that we're talking about. So we have this instrumented world generating huge amounts of data. And as Stian said a few minutes ago, we have myriad organisations taking a little view of a little bit of data and creating an app saying, look what I've found. So the first thing is instrumented, generation of data. The second thing that has really reshaped how the world is literally wired together is the interconnected part. If you're generating a huge amount of data, who cares if it doesn't go anywhere? So the next big issue, and it's driven primarily by telephone companies around the world, is the movement of this data from place to place, person to person, organisation to organisation. And so we hear the big switch manufacturers and telcos and others building this vast capability into the networks to transport all this data. But then for us, the thing that really matters is you get to the third thing that I think is really important, and that's the idea of intelligence. What is it telling us? What can we see? And so we get to this world of understanding, what is this data really saying? What's here? What can I learn? And the way in which that kind of comes together is an analysis that essentially starts with us understanding what happened. What do we see, what patterns can we see in this data that explain what happened? Because once you've done that, you can test your model by looking at what's going on now and saying, what kind of things can I ask myself about what I can see to prove my model? Because if you can do that, you get to the thing that humans in history have wanted more than anything else, which is to accurately predict the future. So you get to predictive modelling. Now it's getting interesting, because we say we can actually understand all this data, we can put some models together, and now we can talk about what's next. Because if you know what's next, you can start doing some planning, some strategic decision making, some really visionary thinking about what you want, because you've got some confidence you can manage the variables to get the result that you're looking for. So if you take this instrumented, interconnected and intelligent world, you then say, I've got something here that I can really manage. Harvard has started to increasingly write about what they call fact-based management. Fact-based management. I'm not sure there's been a younger governing mayor than 32 years of age, Stian. He's very young. People nowadays look at my generation, some of us in the room, who have a good education, have worked hard, good experience, results or whatever. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. People today, show me the facts. Show me the data. What do the facts say? And increasingly, that's how commerce in particular and the public sector are now starting to generate their views of the future. What facts do I have? Don't tell me your opinion. Don't tell me what you think. Don't tell me you've got a group of people together who decided something. Show me the facts. Show me these statistics. So if you take that view that I've just given you about how the world of technology is, and then say, well, what can I see in cities? Then we see a couple of other themes happening in cities. Oslo in particular and Norway is a particularly interesting country as part of the Nordics, which are a particularly interesting area of the world, and I'll come back to that. But what we can see globally since the GFC later in the previous decade is national governments are moving into very few areas and moving, in general, out of cities, kind of leaving cities to themselves. And so we've got, I won't bore you, but there's some numbers that show now that the big governments are really focused on 4 things only. National governments around the world really care about some kind of social welfare system. They're heavily invested in some kind of health system. They care about customs, ports and borders. And they're very focused on defence. And of course, they pay for it all with tax. But then you say, not so much in the Nordics, but in many countries, so, well, what about my city? What about transport, water, buildings, energy, waste, education, labour market, entrepreneurship, commerce? Where's all that? National governments are increasing, well, we haven't got any money for that because we're too busy doing health. So what we're seeing in an unprecedented way is the public and private sector coming together at city level to try and solve some of these problems. And so at IBM, we're moving away from the kind of product view of the world. We've still got that. We've got some fantastic people in our business who work very hard to sell the generic technologies. But increasingly, it's about the solution. So I want to just talk about a few areas that we're operating in. We're very focused on. Transport is very important. Transport is not really the idea of road transport, which is what people tend to think about. Or secondly, they might say, oh, it's really public transport. Transport is really increasingly becoming about urban mobility. How do I move people around my city? I don't really care if they're on a tram or a bicycle. How do I move these people around? So we're starting to see this concept of urban mobility, where we need statistics to say, well, who's come from where to where? How do we manage that so that we're optimising the use of the assets? How do we plan for capacity by putting pooled electric vehicles around district stations that might be consolidation points for public sector transport, public transportation. Auto manufacturers, car manufacturers, and we're working with three big Japanese, 3 big German, 3 big American, have said the days of individual ownership of a capital thing called a car are over. They now see themselves as software platforms on wheels. Volvo have said by 2025, no one will be killed as a result of being in a Volvo car. At ITS recently, the Global Transport Institute, they agreed that in 2035, it will be impossible for one vehicle to hit another vehicle. I don't have any grandchildren, maybe it might be a little bit further. I'm sure we're not far from the days when grandchildren say, tell us about when you used to swing on the wheel and push the thing on the floor, you know. Tell us that again, you know. I use a photo in a presentation. I was told no charts because I got several thousand charts I could have bored you with. I've got a great photo of London in the first decade of the 20th century where people like us all got around and had conferences about what we're going to do about the horse manure. What are we going to do with the horse manure? And you know, the mathematicians worked out that they were going to have 9 feet of horse manure covering London if we extrapolated the car came along, couldn't find a horse. Couldn't even find a horse, let alone the manure, because the car arrived. I've got another photo that shows, I don't know, Las Vegas or somewhere, but Los Angeles somewhere, but a typical American spaghetti network, just packed with cars. I'm convinced in 100 years, people will look at that photograph and laugh, just as you did when I was talking about the horseman. What the hell is that? We're moving to transport in a way that is really about people moving around a city in the most optimum way rather than deciding whether they're going to be in Oslo and be in part of the most electric car capital of the world or buy a big VO, whatever the hell. Those days are passing. We're doing a lot of work in transport. Water is a big issue around the world. Middle East, Africa, other places, people have just started to realise, as part of the climate change that Stian referred to, water is incredibly important, crucially important. Unfortunately, the Athenians and the Romans didn't think it was a good idea to separate rainwater from sewerage. So most cities in the world still have the two mixing. Cities around the world are saying, we've got to separate these things. How do we have a finite resource like water and manage it economically well? Usually I have some water and I can pick up my water and say, someone paid, not sure a krona, someone paid €2 for this water, yet they paid 0.00002 cents for a litre from the tap at home. And government officials say, I want to arbitrage that gap. How do I fix that? So water is something that people have realised. It rains, drains through the city, it's used. We're working with a city in China that is heavily dependent on the textile industry. And it costs them 61 litres per pair of jeans to make a pair of jeans. And they're looking at us saying, in the middle of August 2017, we can no longer expand because we will be out of water. So this is all statistics. How do we fix it? How do we change that modelling? So there's a lot going on in water I could talk about. Public safety and emergency management. Less of an issue in this part of the world, but certainly in the band around the equator, there are numerous cities constantly hammered with hurricanes, typhoons, floods, earthquakes. We just saw the dreadful problems in Vanuatu with the hurricane recently and Nepal. These cities typically don't have particularly good planning, don't have particularly good management of the event, and find it very difficult to recover. So we're doing a lot of work around that. IBM's just signed an agreement with the Weather Channel, you may have seen, to do narrowcast weather forecasting to help anticipate, manage and work through some of these disasters. And something, of course, that's so important here in Norway, building and energy management is a critical issue, and we're seeing transformation perhaps like no other industry, where the use and distribution of power and how it's used both at a micro level and then across the the country and the world is huge. Waste, air quality management, these are issues that, in my view, define smarter cities. What we see are city leaders, really visionary people, who say, I want to make a difference in an area. And in my experience, cities don't do everything. If you're in a wealthy, well-resourced, well-led, well-educated city like Oslo, it's a bit easier. If you're in many other cities in the world, you've got some really serious problems. And so they tend to work on those. In cities like Oslo, where you have the ability to see and experience some of the problems that big cities face, but you've still got the things you need: vision, resources, education, entrepreneurs, to address these issues. I think you can make a lot of progress relatively quickly. I don't think these problems will be solved in Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Tokyo. These are big, difficult cities. So I think there's an opportunity. One of the things that we've found is that as cities get started and put these programs in place, it brings entrepreneurship to the systems. Many entrepreneurs come around a base that cities put in place. Just a little bit more of technology. I know there are some business leaders in the audience. IBM thinks about 3 different IT kind of areas. Again, Stian mentioned that our younger people today think the world is solved with an app. And he said it, and it was funny because it's not quite true, but people think there's some good value in it, and we think there is. So really, the IT industry has been built for 50 years on what are called systems of record. Boring as hell. The billing system that gets our utilities and our telco bills sent to us. HR, finance, all the things that just exist that we're used to, that really have marked the IT industry for 50 years. They've now been overshadowed by 2 incredibly interesting areas of focus. The first is systems of insight. So how do we get this management information together? How do we put on Stian's desk a dashboard so that he can see exactly the city heartbeat, the pulse of Oslo as the day passes? And how does he intervene? So systems of insight are very significant. Apps tend to take a very little bit of information and a very little way to use them, and then give very broad access to a very little bit. Systems of insight are all about huge amounts of data, and the app becomes the icing on the cake. It's very, very different. And the third thing is a really interesting thing, which we call systems of engagement. I think it's most interesting because it's how we as individuals think and live our lives. And the systems of engagement have really changed. You know, put up your hand if you used to have to stand in line forever to get a driver's licence and then cross the road to go somewhere. You know, terrible ways in which we dealt with people. Today, it's all on the phone. We've got an ability to engage. More than that, we've got two-way communication. So I talked earlier about cities that have been around for a very long time, that typically it was a one-way street. Most governments, there are still some in the world today, take a very one-way view of things. We're the government, here it comes. Suddenly, we have social networks. Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Pinterest, where we as individuals or groups can express ourselves immediately and make our opinions and views well known to those that matter. All of us have seen business leaders and politicians who said or did something on Thursday, didn't have a job on Monday because of these systems of engagement. More importantly, these systems are shaping the services that we as individuals consume and give entrepreneurs the chance to consider things that were never possible because they can weave systems of insight, systems of engagement, systems of record together with a massive amount of data to change the way in which we live our lives. So I think Smarter Cities has moved on, A few years ago, it was kind of everything's being smarter. I don't think cities are smart or not smart. I think they're evolving. I think they'll evolve for a long time. It's very interesting to see. I'm getting old. You see, Stian puts a chart up that ends at 2050. And I think, 2050, it's not so far away. It's starting, the 20th century is looking further and further behind. I think that's the right kind of planning. We've got to think 20, 30 years out. Norway is a country famous. It's famous in the world as a very rich, well-educated country that makes decisions that are strategic and thinks and operates in the short term with interest in the long term. So I think smarter cities means that these cities will evolve over time. And I think that the important thing is to take specific things and then deliver results. Specific focus on air quality, specific focus on transport, a specific focus in water, a specific focus in waste perhaps, or air management. So I'll leave it there. I wish you well. I'm around. Lars is here from the office, and Alexei Ershov, who runs our business for me here in Europe, our Smarter Cities business. We think this is a really interesting business where the market has moved from bits and pieces and technology to fix my problem. And I think we've had a generational change where senior executives used to think IT was something done by the IT group and it was something they couldn't really get involved in, to now where leaders like Stian and others are quite comfortable with it. They've grown up with it, and they say it's a tool like many other things I have to use to get the results I really need to change the way in which we lead the quality of our lives. So thank you very much for having me. I think that's about the time I had. I'd be happy to take a question. I'll be here over the coffee break for those that can speak Australian, and I'm very pleased to have been here this morning.
To ask a question?
Hi. I just had a question about what do you think the challenge of businesses the need that they need to show return on investment in a short term versus the long-term perspective that you are talking about?
Of course, it's the perennial issue in business. Without being specific, in general, I think it's very easy to make business cases in this part of the business. I think if you think about some things I talked about, we talked about optimising things that aren't very optimal, in my view, increasing capacity, introducing innovation, and the most important is having a business case that shows the return on investment. So I think you can do that relatively easily with a couple of conditions. The first is that the world has moved away from big investments, big IT projects, big custom things that take years. Gone. People say, if I can't get results in 90 days, we get clients talk to me. They say, if I can't get results in 90, 120, 180, I don't do it. And cloud has really helped with that. Cloud gives you the chance to start consuming a functionality to deliver results quickly without a trailing capital cost or an IT department that tells you it'll be ready in 2018. So I think the first thing is this move to fast results and fast return. There's a second thing embedded in the business case that's so important. It's so important that people miss. We love it because we find it, but it doesn't always make us popular. This is about transformation. So at one level, if you think you've got a system today that looks like this and you're going to now build an incremental system over here, it won't work. You can't afford it. It has to change. It must transform. It must change the way things happen. So, I was with the top policeman in a big police organisation. It's a pretty, it's an uncomfortable example. But he was very anxious with domestic violence in his jurisdiction. And he said the problem was he was using a huge amount of police resource on domestic violence, which wasn't really solving the problem, wasn't really, the criminal system couldn't cope with it. Really, he just had to dry the people out and get on with the Monday and then go back next weekend with the same thing. And he wanted to do something about it. So he contacted the social services people. And they said, oh yeah, they'd go and sort it out, have a look. They came back and said, look, we don't think this is social services, this is a health problem, this is alcohol and depression. So then they said, well, actually, the real issue here is chronic unemployment, and we've got to get education involved. So that's a fantastic example of how what used to be a police issue, domestic violence, is a community issue about why are these people chronically unemployed. And so historically, we would say, how do we manage that through the police system? And the social service guys were here and health was here and they all lived in their own world. Today, that electronic fabric I talked about brings all that together. But that means you've got to change all these things. You can't leave the existing structures and then pretend you're going to deal with domestic violence with a new project. You've got to use the money and the facilities and the skills and all the things you've developed here to apply it in a new way, which makes the business case so easy. But making those changes is culturally very difficult. Again, it takes leadership. I would say it takes a crisis for people to devote themselves to change those structures.
Any more questions?
Anders Helvred, University of Oslo. Public transport is important, but how can we get the peak of public transport much broader and use it more efficiently?
Well, I think you get
how can you provide that?
I think you get the peaks much broader. I don't. I've got an American phone in my pocket. I should have. I don't, but I have. I've got it somewhere. If I call my family in Australia from Oslo, in 2 months' time, someone I've never heard of will send me a bill for $12.60 for calling Australia from Oslo on my American phone for a cost of for 6 minutes and 19 seconds. That's very, very granular user pays. If I go back to my home, there'll be a bill there from the power company saying I used 716 kilowatts and I owe them $219.40. That's user. The whole world is built on user pays. Public transport isn't. So what we're going to see in transport, if I have 6 people in a car and they drive up the road, I charge the car. If I have 6 people on a train, I've got a ticket inspector saying, where's your ticket? Everybody. So that's going to change. And what we've found in a variety of projects that we've put in place around the world is that public policy that is shaped around the use of transport and the costs associated with it changes use immediately. If you say it's cheaper to be here at 7 a.m, before 7 a.m. than after 7 a.m, you'll get killed at the door at 7 o'clock. If you make the peak hour system 6 a.m. to 10 p.m, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m, and price it accordingly, you will broaden the use of that system. And we are seeing public systems around the world looking to user pays to change the way in which peaks and troughs occur. But it's politically very difficult. It takes leadership, it takes community participation, it takes an understanding of the big picture, it takes transformation of the cost structures to really change that. But we see time and time again behaviour around things like public transport, water use. We've got lots of stories about water use. It changes very dramatically when the costs of user pays change.
Okay. Is there one last question before we round this off and have a coffee break?
Well, thanks again. It's terrific to be here. Thank you.